This is Factorio. It's a game about building factories. But if we peel back the logistics and layers of polluting smog, is there a deeper narrative here? Much like Gleber's crusty surface, I think there's something underneath. And while there is no official law from the devs, there are things in-game that hint to some pretty terrifying realities. The best place to start is, well, at the start. At the start of every playthrough, we're ushered into the game by a panning camera, some explosions, and a pretty effed up ship. Hey, any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. The ship tells the obvious. We've crashed on an alien planet, and we must survive. The only way forward is through science. And, well, that's it. Not a lot to go off of, but let's take a look at the engineer. If we look deeper with how he interacts with the world, or worlds should I say, more becomes apparent. Zooming in reveals that they're clearly human, or at least they're designed to look like a human. Unaffected by different gravities, biomes, or even breathable air, all indicates that this guy is some kind of robot. But I think we can just chalk this one up to video game logic. It is funny to consider that the engineer doesn't need to eat or sleep, or is unaffected by radiation, can hold millions of tons worth of stuff, etc. There are some things in Factorio that just aren't possible. Like, just take a look at how close the planets all are to each other. With the release of Space Age, we were given a lot more to work with. Let's take a look at the planets. The starting world Nauvis is totally hostile to outsiders, with the biters having a symbiotic relationship with the planet. They act as a sort of deterrent to anyone trying to settle on the planet, and it's clear that they have done so, as it's uninhabited. They're particularly fascinating because CO2 pollution causes them to rapidly evolve, which might indicate that other attempts to come to Nauvis has been stopped because of this. The pollution of one character, albeit a busy one, is enough to make them a real threat. That means an entire civilization would really not be viable on the planet. The name Nauvis simply means new. Vulcanus is just as hostile. The lava and territorial worms has probably kept anyone else out. They're kind of interesting as they've evolved to have hard metal exteriors, which is not totally unlike some animals we have on Earth. The only other interesting point I could find about Vulcanus is its burnt trees, suggesting that its current state is relatively recent. Its proximity to the sun clearly makes it a hotter planet, but giant pools of lava don't just appear on hot planets. It's clear that some sort of geological event has caused Vulcanus to look like this. The name Vulcanus simply is derived from volcano. On the other side of the spectrum, and on the opposite side of the solar system, we have Aquila. In mythology, Aquila is the Roman god of storms and winter, so it's fitting that it's a frozen hellscape. It's effectively Pluto, as its proximity to the sun makes it incredibly cold. Aquila did have these guys at one point in the dev cycle, but I think they were removed because the planet is difficult as it is. Gleber, lore-wise, tells us that the universe is a harsh and unfair place. Fittingly, a Gleber is a kind of spore, so it makes sense that the planet is this just mushy, gross swamp full of biology. Its native pentapods also would have kept anyone off-planet, but unlike the biters of Nauvis, they don't respond to pollution, they respond to spores in the air caused by the resource plants. I think the most interesting planet lore-wise to look at is Fulgora, for one main reason. And it's not the oily seas. No. Someone else has been here. It's clear that they weren't human, and that they've been gone for a long, long time. But what we can tell is that they had all the resources to get off-world. What's interesting is there is a severe lack of evidence of them on any of the other planets, which indicates that they maybe didn't, or that the other planets were just simply too hostile for them. It's unclear what happened to them, but the oily seas suggest that they were not human, and could thrive without water. This strength could have also been their biggest weakness, as all the other planets are much less rich in oil, which they likely would have needed to survive. It's also totally possible that Fulgora was not a home world. A spacefaring civilization could have come through the solar system and decided that Fulgora was simply the most habitable. But, well, it's clear that it wasn't. The violent lightning storms that come at night may be an obvious culprit for what happened to the Fulgorians, but they clearly had mastered it with their still functioning lightning towers. What happened to them is a mystery, but what we can tell is that they maybe didn't settle on the other planets, due to the threats that they presented. So what can we tell from our investigation so far? Well, not too much. We know that the planets are mostly uninhabited, and for good reason. Each has enough to steer any galaxy-venturing civilization away from them. They kept the Fulgorians off of them, but more importantly, they also have kept the engineer's people and civilization off of them. More on that later. I think we're yet to get into the real meat of our investigation, namely, this is perhaps the most terrifying thing about the game, and something most players wouldn't stop to consider. In the opening sequence of Factorio, we see a crashed rocket with the player beside it. This is the ship that we crashed in, but here's the crucial detail you probably didn't even consider when you dismantled it for scrap. Look at its size. While it is a complex rocket with an actual paint job, what a luxury, this thing is tiny. Sure, compared to the player, it's sizable, but now with Space Age we can see the size of ships that can be created. It is possible that this landing craft is made of more advanced tech, but judging by its appearance, it matches a lot of our conventional understandings of a pretty regular spaceship. So that begs the question, why can't the engineer build something similar and go home? Well, there could be 100 reasons, but here are a handful that I think are most interesting, with the most terrifying being the one that I think is actually implied. The engineer doesn't want to go back. For whatever reason, he doesn't want to return to his homeworld and is simply trying to survive in his new environment. Maybe he's a fugitive. Maybe he's committed some heinous crimes on his own planet. He does seem to be adept at building incredibly dangerous weaponry with very little material. Also, he has zero remorse for nuking the bugs, so I think it's safe to say he's a psychopath. Alternatively, the engineer simply can't go back. Inspecting your landing craft again reveals something else. With its small size in mind, is it not maybe a drop pod of a larger vessel? Factorio has a single line of speech in the entire game, making it incredibly important. I think most players would have missed it, but in the tutorial there's a line that says, "The escape pod saved my life, and I'm afraid the others were not so lucky." This tells us that this is in fact an escape pod, and that it was ejected from a much larger vessel, and that there were others. So what happened to this vessel and to the other crew? Maybe it walked away? Maybe it's still lost somewhere out there in space with no power. It would be undetectable to the player even with space travel and radar. Cryogenics also exists in Factorio, so maybe the engineer has been traveling for longer than we think, only waking up when the pod began its descent. I think the others that the line refers to are the other engineers if you're playing multiplayer, because, well, it's clear that they didn't land anywhere on Nauvis or in the solar system. I think the reality of the engineer's position is much more terrifying and sad. We haven't considered one final element revealed by Space Age. If we fix our gaze further than the safe horizons of Nauvis, past the piss swamps of Kleber and the worms of Vulcanus, the oily seas of Fulgora and the frozen crust of Aquila, there is one final place, and that is the Shattered Planet, which I believe is the home of our poor engineer. Some cataclysmic event destroyed his home, and he is the sole survivor. He escaped to Nauvis, and so begins your playthrough of Factorio. It's sort of painfully ironic. He has incredible power and knowledge at his disposal. He can conquer the planets, build enormous factories, create chaos from order, but he can't bring back his home world. Thanks for watching.